Rafah, which is at the southernmost part, bordering with Egypt. So we're talking about over a million, perhaps a million and a quarter, even a bit more than that, people who are concentrated in an area which is perhaps 20% of the entire Gaza Strip, and that these evacuees will have to be moved before there is a large-scale military operation. And that's one thing that the Israeli army, is saying to me. And the other thing is that they need some kind of deconfliction mechanism with the Egyptian army, which is there on the border, for there to be a large operation. These two things haven't yet taken place. If they do take place, they'll take probably still weeks.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest situation in Gaza, where the war between Israel and Hamas continues. And I'm delighted to be joined once again by Anshel Pfeffer, the Times reporter in Jerusalem. Anshel, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, James.
I wanted to start, first of all, by talking about the situation in Rafa in the south of the Gaza Strip, and Israel reportedly planning a new offensive there, despite warnings from the Americans and others against such an offensive. Do you think we are just days away from seeing that offensive beginning?
I don't think it's days away. It's become something that obviously has been making the headlines in recent days. The reason it's making the headlines is because Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, suddenly brought it up at a press conference last week. And this was something that he did for the Israeli media. And it looks like this was mainly something meant for kind of boosting perhaps Netanyahu's dwindling base in Israel, where he suddenly brought out this statement that I've given the orders to operate in Rafah. Then he brought it up again on Friday in the statement. This time he said that I've given the Israeli army the orders to stop preparing a movement of population away from Gaza. He mentioned it as well, I think, in an interview with the American media over the weekend. But from what I know, there isn't an imminent attack. There isn't troops aren't being mustered right now for this. Of course, there could be some kind of surprise operation that I'm not aware of, but it doesn't look and feel that there are the kind of forces that Israel would need to carry this out. And from what I know from discussions within the Israeli military, that they would first of all need some type of warning to the local population. Let's just kind of explain what the situation in Rafah on the ground is now. Over half of the population of the entire Gaza Strip has now been evacuated from Gaza City and from other main areas in the Gaza Strip to Rafah, which is at the southernmost part, bordering with Egypt. So we're talking about over a million, perhaps a million and a quarter, even a bit more than that, people who are concentrated in an area which is perhaps 20% of the entire Gaza Strip, and that these evacuees will have to be moved before there is a large-scale military operation. And that's one thing that the Israeli army, is saying to me. And the other thing is that they need some kind of deconfliction mechanism with the Egyptian army, which is there on the border, for there to be a large operation. These two things haven't yet taken place. If they do take place, they'll take probably still weeks. And in the previous big pushes that Israel made, first of all in Gaza City, in the north of Gaza Strip, and then in Khan Yunis, the second largest city where the Israeli army is now operating, there was leaflets were dropped from the air. There were warnings over regular media, social media, etc., to population there that they should move away from those areas because it's about to become a war zone. This hasn't even started yet with Rafah. So I think that it's pretty safe to assume that what Netanyahu has been saying has been mainly aimed at kind of trying to show the Israeli public that he is determined to pursue this war to the end. And because Rafah is the main area of Gaza where Israel has yet to operate, he's made Rafah into this big target. But there just doesn't seem to be yet on the ground any movement for an operation there.
And were there to be at some stage, and I absolutely appreciate what you say, Anshel, about the conditions being difficult for an offensive at the moment, were it to happen, let's say in a few weeks' time, I mean, where would people be evacuated to? Where else is there in Gaza that civilians could flee?
Well, the only place they really could be evacuated to are parts of Gaza where the Israeli military is operating right now. So there would have to be some kind of uh, almost a jigsaw or a Tetris kind of movement for that to happen. So it would be a complex movement of population. It would take time. Uh, there would have to be some kind of mechanism whereby people could, the various corridors through which they could move back up north, and that's something that, like I said, will take time. And I mean, I can understand why this has suddenly become such a big issue and why people are warning about it. But I do think that it's mainly Netanyahu's political rhetoric for domestic consumption rather than an actual imminent operational military plan.
That's really interesting. I mean, we have had the warnings from Anthony Blinken, also David Cameron, the UK Foreign Secretary, has been very strong on this over the weekend. Do you do you think that Netanyahu will pay much attention to voices like that in relation to the Rafah situation?
Well, once again, it really depends on how serious he actually is about carrying it out now. And I don't think that there is a plan right now for it to happen in the next few days. So it kind of works for people like Blinken and David Cameron to make it look as if they're being tough with Netanyahu, and then because there is an actual operation happening, but yeah, talk is cheap. So Blinken and
Mm.
Cameron can come out here with this kind of taking a tough stance on Netanyahu, but when there isn't a real plan for it to happen right
I wanted to ask you about Benjamin Netanyahu's restated aim of total victory in Gaza. First of all, how do you define that? And also, or more to the point, how does he define it? And is it attainable?
now. Well, like you said, how do you define that? Total victory is totally a total hollow slogan. And if you speak to the professional military people who are involved in planning and implementing Israel's war in Gaza, they don't use that word. That's something that Netanyahu has only started using in the last 2 or 3 weeks. He's been using it largely because he's seen his own situation in the polls continue to deteriorate. A much smaller percentage of Israelis trust him to continue leading Israel in this situation. At the same time, he's seeing in the polls that Israelis do think that the war against Hamas has to be pursued and shouldn't just end. So he's trying to latch on to a public sentiment by spouting these slogans. But even when he was asked in the press conference last week, uh, um, how do you describe a total victory? So he gave this like really bizarre allegory of smashing a glass and then starting to smash the pieces of the glass and smash them again into smaller and smaller pieces. And nobody really understood what he was talking about. And it was clear that this is a slogan, and he's trying to kind of reflect what the Israeli public are thinking, while the Israeli public really don't trust him to deliver that victory, whatever it means.
I've heard people say that there's sort of three planks potentially to this total victory strategy. One is eliminating the Hamas leadership, but that's more difficult than you might think. Next is securing Israel, but of course, most Israelis now have lost trust in Netanyahu's ability to keep Israel secure after October the 7th. And number three is returning the hostages. But surely pursuing the military strategy of targeting Hamas is at risk potentially of endangering the safety of the hostages, and maybe the two are incompatible for the time being.
Well, I asked an Israeli general about that a few days ago, about how he defines victory, and he said, "Look, I'm a professional military person. I have to use words which have a meaning." And he was kind of criticizing without actually mentioning the prime minister there. And he said, "We talk about dismantling Hamas's military capabilities. We being the Israeli army have a specific idea of what Hamas's military framework is, and we are busy in trying to dismantle that in the sense that all these people who are members of Hamas battalions, obviously they're trying to kill as many as they can, capture and just move them out of the areas where they are, break down their military hierarchy. That's a military objective. And then he said that when we talk about the hostages, obviously there's nothing we'd like more than to have a hostage rescue operation, but we're aware that the possibilities of that when hostages are being scattered in dozens of locations underground and are also being used as human shields for the Hamas leadership, that the IDF, the Israeli army, realizes that is unfeasible, but they see their role as putting pressure on Hamas's leadership on the ground, which will help lead to some kind of a hostage agreement that Israel can agree to with through the various brokers with the Hamas leadership. So you're right; those two goals of dismantling Hamas, certainly as a military organization, and rescuing the Israeli hostages who are still being held captive in Gaza, are very difficult things to do. Both of them by military means when the hostages are being held in so many locations under the ground. But at the same time, this is something that they believe can be achieved at least partly through military means by pressuring those who are holding them and to agree to some kind of exchange which Israel can accept.
Where is public opinion at the moment in Israel? You mentioned, Anshel, that the overwhelming majority of Israelis are still supportive of the war, but I know there's been a huge amount of criticism for Benjamin Netanyahu over the failure to secure the release of more of the hostages. So, what is the current mood?
So what you're seeing now in Israel is almost unique in the science of public opinion and polling because pollsters have this thing called a rallying around the flag effect. So a nation which goes to war, there is certainly in the first period of the war, first weeks and months of the war, there's a rallying around the flag effect, meaning people are patriotic, people support the army, they support the war aims and so on. That's something that's seen in many countries which are at war. This is also seen in these countries as, once again, in these earlier stages, as a higher level of the neutral support for the leadership. You're not seeing that in Israel. So you're seeing at the same time a support for the war, you're seeing support for the army, and a total collapse of trust in Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, which, like I say, is pretty unique. And I think that there's this kind of understanding amongst Israelis, and once again, we're seeing this in the polls, that they feel that the war against Hamas is something which has to be pursued because of what happened on October 7th, Hamas's attack and massacres, and at the same time, Netanyahu is seen as someone who is responsible for for this worst tragedy ever to befall Israel in its 76 years of history. So they think the war can be pursued. They think the war has to be pursued by the army. They support the army. Don't forget, many Israelis themselves serve in the army, and there's a very large proportion of reserve soldiers who were called up on that day on October 7th. Some of them are still in uniform, but they don't see Netanyahu in any way as the one who can lead them through this war.
Which begs the question, why is he still in post? We're more than 5 months on now from the 7th of October. There were people then saying he may be gone within a matter of weeks or months, but he is the great survivor of Israeli politics. And while some cynics have suggested he's prosecuting the war in the way he is in order to remain in power, it appears he's not prosecuting it particularly successfully in terms of meeting his own objectives. So why hasn't there been more movement to replace him?
Well, the fact that a prime minister is deeply unpopular doesn't mean that you can replace the prime minister overnight. That's the case in many places. There are parliamentary procedures. There are, in this case, perhaps even an election that would need to be held first. Netanyahu is not planning to resign. It's not in his nature. It's not in, he is incapable of contemplating the idea of leaving voluntarily, even though he sees the polls like everyone else that only about 20% of Israelis still think that he should remain prime minister, and three-quarters of Israelis want him to go. So for that to happen, there still needs to be some kind of parliamentary process, and that process for there to be a majority coalescing in Israeli parliament in the Knesset, either around someone else who can be prime minister in this Knesset or around dissolving the Knesset and holding a new election, is is as you say something which is difficult to to make happen during wartime because while Israelis want to see Netanyahu go, they don't necessarily want to see a divisive and toxic election campaign held right now during the time of war. So Netanyahu is the beneficiary of the fact that while Israelis don't want him as prime minister, they don't want the kind of process which will force him out of office to happen right now. And does that mean he's prolonging the war? Well, it's a really good question. I can't tell you what Netanyahu thinks, but there certainly is a feeling amongst some people that the way in which the war is pursued is also giving Netanyahu more breathing space, and that could be tainting the way that he's trying to run the country at this time.
If his objective of total victory, however he defines it, is unobtainable, is there a potential off ramp in terms of saving face for Netanyahu, allowing Israelis to feel like the war has borne fruit and met some of its objectives without necessarily achieving all of its aims? I mean, for example, were Yahya Sinwar, the man many believe to be behind the October 7th attacks, to be captured or killed, would that be something that could be portrayed as a victory in Israel and would allow moves towards a ceasefire?
Well, the main off-ramp that people that is being seen now is the hostage agreement, because we've sort of, we mentioned them before. There are around 130 hostages, though a certain number of them are presumed to be dead already, but there still is in the region of 90 to 100 hostages being held in Gaza, and Israel and the Israeli public, their families certainly want to see them released as soon as possible. They've been held now for 130 days. So that is a potential off ramp. If a agreement can be sorry, if an agreement can be reached somehow with Hamas to release them or to release most of them, so as part of that agreement, there would have to be a ceasefire, which would last probably at least a month. Whether the war would resume again after that month remains to be seen, but that would give that period. Also, there would be, I think, for many Israelis, the trauma of so many hostages, and we're talking here about entire families and ages of from young children to elderly people being held in Gaza. If that saga was to end, that would potentially be an off ramp. You mentioned if Sinwar, the Hamas chief in Gaza, was basically the mastermind of the October 7th attack, if he was captured or killed, that could also potentially be some kind of an off ramp. But it's not just that. I mean, even those who disagree with Netanyahu do believe that there probably is at some point a need two operations in Rafah, not just because this is the only Hamas stronghold or big stronghold remaining. This is also the area near the border where most of the weapons have been smuggled in. So some type of operation would probably be needed at that bit there if Israel is to achieve not necessarily the total victory, but to kind of bring the situation in Gaza to a different place where perhaps it could be disarmed. You could have this removal of most of the of major arms systems being held in Gaza and trying to ensure that they wouldn't be renewed once the war is over. So Rafah is somewhere where things are going to have to change in Rafah in the sense of how how the border crossings work, the smuggling and so on. That is something that even if you put aside Netanyahu's political considerations, and even if you can work out a ceasefire, something's going to happen. Something's going to have to happen there, and that is that will remain a concern even if there is this off ramp of a hostage agreement or the Hamas leadership being captured.
Antony Blinken has been floating this idea of some kind of deal whereby Saudi Arabia would normalize relations with Israel in exchange for Israel recognizing an independent nation for the Palestinians. Do you see any prospect of the Israelis agreeing to that?
Well, right now, the Israeli public is still heavily traumatized by what happened on October 7th. And when, not for all, but for many Israelis, when they hear the idea of, okay, let's go towards a Palestinian state, they'll say, hold on, there was a tiny Palestinian state here on our border. On October 7th, they crossed over and killed 1,200 people and captured 250 hostages. Who will guarantee to Israel if there's a larger Palestinian state on its border and parts of Israel or parts of territory which Israel currently occupies will be relinquished or given over to that state? Who is to guarantee that doesn't happen again? So that feeling is still very strong right now in Israel, and I think that the Blinken plan it kind of makes a lot of sense on paper. Everyone gets Israel's supposed to get security and relations with the Saudis, and the Palestinians supposed to get a state, and there's supposed to be some kind of like Saudi and the Emirati kind of coming in and rebuilding Gaza. It looks great on paper, but we've got to ask ourselves: for 30 years, there's been this idea of a two-state solution around, and it hasn't happened. Why would it necessarily happen after this terrible war, uh, in which both sides have suffered so much? So I think the idea of the Blinken plan is a very good idea, but it kind of needs a bit of a longer period, both for Israelis and Palestinians, to be able to just you know absorb the idea, digest the fact that they can reach a two-state solution, and you're not seeing on either side, I think, that much willingness suddenly to become two states living side by side peacefully. Um, so I think this is a good idea, but it has to be given time for Israelis and Palestinians to get first of all for this war to end and for them to get used to it. And I'm hearing more and more from the Americans that they're realizing this, and as a consequence, they're saying two different things now. One is they're saying, let's first of all try and help a hostage agreement, because if we can solve the hostage issue, then we can also show Israelis and Palestinians that they can agree to some things. We can get one of the biggest problems that was created on October 7 out of the way, and we'll be in a process that we can talk about other things then. And the other thing they say is that to make this deal work, it's not just enough for the Israelis and Palestinians to agree to it. They also need a second Biden term, because I think the Americans now realize that than just having a few more months before the Americans go full on into their season probably won't be enough. And this would be this assuming Joe Biden can win the election, this would be a second term project, because this will take a lot more than just a few months.
And to what extent does Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government more broadly still care about the messages coming from Washington? I mean, Antony Blinken's rhetoric has sort of stepped up a bit over recent weeks and months in terms of urging restraint on Israel's part. I mentioned David Cameron, the UK Foreign Secretary, seems to be more critical of Israel than some of his predecessors. I know a lot of people say that Israel fundamentally cares about its security, not its popularity, but will those warnings be heeded by the Israelis?
Well, you can see by what's coming out from the conversation that Netanyahu is having both over the phone with Biden and Blinken, who was here over the last week. Blinken's already been here 5 or 6 times, and other senior American officials are coming. You can hear that from what's being leaked from these conversations. Netanyahu is a lot more flexible in private with the Americans than he seems to the Israeli public, and this is no surprise, obviously, and it's not. Netanyahu won't be the first leader to say one thing to the Americans in the room and say something else to his public uh, in public. But yes, I think he is concerned by what the Americans are saying, and that's why he's given Biden some kind of an idea that they can work on this solution, even though to the Israeli public he won't say it. But at the end of the day, Netanyahu is concerned more than anything about his own political survival. His political base is a right wing one. They currently are incapable of contemplating the Biden or the American or the Blink, whatever you want to call it, package, and he won't accept it in public, at least until the Americans press him a lot more seriously than that. And what we're seeing right now, the Americans are trying to go, as I said, through first of all having a hostage agreement first, as a way perhaps of preparing the Israeli public opinion. I think the Americans realize that it's not going to happen with Netanyahu either. And they're also saying that the current Palestinian leadership, certainly not Hamas or the 84-year-old Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, none of these seem to the Americans good candidates. So they want Biden to remain for a second term and to have different leaders on the Israeli and the Palestinian sides to be able to implement this. I'll be very surprised if it happens with Netanyahu still in power, but he's going to continue trying to say different things to different people and playing for time.
Just finally, Anshel, I wanted to ask you about the wider regional implications of the conflict. Obviously, we've seen now US strikes on Jordan in the wake of 3 US soldiers being killed there. Sorry, US strikes on targets in in Iraq and Syria in response to the 3 soldiers being killed in Jordan. We've seen the situation with the Houthis in the Red Sea and the UK and the US airstrikes there. And in particular, I'm not hearing necessarily as much as I think probably we should be hearing about the situation with Hezbollah in Lebanon and calls from some for Israel to actually launch offensives in the south of Lebanon. Can you see the potential for that?
Well, there has been a war for 4 months now on the northern border. Hezbollah has been firing rockets at Israel basically from the day after, from October the 8th. Every day there's been these salvos of rockets. Israel's responded to them. Hezbollah has fired more rockets and so on. And this has kind of remained at the same level of these rockets being fired at relatively short range targets, and not escalating to a full blown war. And it seems that both sides accept that a full scale war isn't in their interests. So if that's not happening right now, the question is, can they So let's say it looks like there isn't much of a prospect of escalation now. But the problem is that from Israel's perspective, 80,000 Israelis have had to leave their homes near the border, and they can't accept that Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy militia, can force such a large number of Israelis from their homes. So what's the solution for that? Some argue that Israel has no choice but to attack Hezbollah and to move them by force back from the border. The Americans have been sending diplomats for all this period to try and get the Lebanese government and Hezbollah themselves to agree to some kind of pullback of Hezbollah forces from the border. We're still waiting to see what happens there. It's been on a knife edge now for 4 months, and it doesn't look like this big all-out war is going to happen because both sides don't want it, but they still need some kind of face-saving agreement which will allow Hezbollah to draw its forces back, and we're still waiting for that to be reached, that deal.
And Anshel, do you think in a month or two's time we will be in a materially different position in Gaza, or do you think we will still be in a situation where the Israeli ground offensive continues, many of the hostages remain in Gaza, and that in essence the war remains in a similar situation to where we are now?
Well, we're just a bit less than 4 weeks away from Ramadan beginning, and all the sides have this interest in Ramadan being a period of ceasefire and for there to be a hostage agreement. Until then, Hamas desperately need to show its own public that they can deliver some kind of period of calm after causing this war, which has so much devastated Gaza and caused so much bloodshed. So Hamas have an interest in it. Israel certainly has an interest in its people coming home. But when you say Israel, then which of the political actors do you mean? And when you say Hamas, also Hamas has its different factions and leaderships. So I say there's an even chance that this time next month when Ramadan begins, there will be a hostage agreement and a month long or at least truce. But even chances is the best I can hope for right now.
Anshel, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us on Frontline.
Thanks, James.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.